Hello, thank you very much. I would like to thank Nathan Brown and Peter Millar for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be speaking at the end of this day because, as you will see, there are enormous amounts of transmissions that are going on, specifically to the one just before. Yes, just as a short introduction, I would like to say that as soon as you're confronted with Friedrich Hölderlin, the question is no longer how does transcendental imagination account for poetry. The question is turned around, what does Friedrich Hölderlin do to transcendental imagination? And I would say that the temporalization of the transcendental conceived by Hölderlin reintroduces or introduces into the transcendental the relation to death, the relation to language, and the dialectization of the near and the far regarding the absolute. And just to place my paper here in relation to the conference. And at issue for me today, I will be reading specifically one poem of Friedrich Hölderlin. At issue for me today is not so much I'm going to try to have it diverge a bit, but at issue is not to take this poem, and it's a wide and narrow issue. Narrowly, the issue is not to re-systemize the corpus of poetry of Friedrich Hölderlin, but more widely, so it's just to concentrate on one poem, but more widely, the issue is in trying to elucidate what he thinks of courage, is to ask how that might change our own relation, how this thinking of courage might change or our own relation to anxiety. So after having said this, I will begin. In Night Songs by Friedrich Hölderlin, published in 1805 paperback almanac by Friedrich Willmans, the poem that I've now titled Ineptitude, placed in the middle of a group of 9 poems, sheds light on the poet's task. This task is to be elucidated according to a specific modality of temporality called the turn of time, die Wende der Zeit in the poem, which refers to the period opened by the French Revolution. How are we to understand the title? I have now tentatively called it Ineptitude, Blödigkeit. And Blödigkeit can be defined in German both as clumsiness, embarrassment, awkwardness, even idiocy, as much as shyness. The matter is further complicated by the fact that Blödigkeit replaces the title Courage of the Poet, an earlier version of this poem. What then does this title have to do with the poem? Does it name a state that the poet must overcome, or does it name a transformation of courage required by poetry, called for by the turn of time? From the outset, Friedrich Hölderlin introduces courage by making it unrecognizable. The hypothesis explored here is as follows. Hölderlin only arrives at a break with classicism, an attunement of poetry to the death of God. He only succeeds in creating a matrix for modern poetry with his late odes and hymns by transforming what courage means. This hypothesis distances itself from the numerous interpretations that see Hölderlin's abandonment after 1800 of a speculative reconciliation of the finite and the infinite within poetry, reference to Schiller, as a turn towards mourning the divine. This perspective identifies Hölderlin's insight that it is impossible to reach the absolute, even in death, with the renunciation of the absolute. Hölderlin's search for sobriety is then likened with a renunciation of exaltation of hybris. His late poetry is considered as operating under the pious injunction to observe limits, to remain within the finite, and be faithful in memory to the flight of the gods. This way of understanding Hölderlin extends all the way to the most intimate enemy of Martin Heidegger, namely Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe. Contrarily to this orientation, relating lyrical sobriety to courage from the outset makes manifest its atheism. So I'm trying to read Hölderlin as an atheist. Atheism, understood in the sense that Jacques Lacan formulates it, namely, I quote, an atheism conceived as a negation of this dimension of a presence of omnipotence at the ground of the world. End of quote. Courage involves a relationship with death, and the poet situates this relation at the points of rupture that death introduces into language. For a long time, Hölderlin seeks these points in tragedy. In the rupture that destroys itself by subjecting the divine to the mastery of knowledge, Oedipus, in the rupture that cancels out its precariousness by rushing towards death, Antigone, in the rupture that transgresses the field of human jurisdiction, Creon. In his production after 1800, there is a shift. It is no longer destiny, but it's modern dissolution that becomes the issue, creating a new difficulty. How does the untying and knotting of bodies to language take its own contingency as object? How does it create provisional, historically unstable transports? Given the impasse of a modern tragedy, can the lyric poem decipher courage in the very vagaries of contingency, in their precariousness? Or can there be a sober relationship to death? Two philosophers have extended the Hölderlinian transformation of courage in very different ways. Walter Benjamin in his essay, Two Poems by Friedrich Hölderlin, and Alain Badiou in The Theory of the Subject. The former insists on the gap between the relations to the world and its transport as the object of poetic activity within the poem, the poematic. But Benjamin asserts that this gap is abolished in the poet's mystical sacrifice. The second, Alain Badiou, in contrast to Hölderlin, insists on the way in which courage diverts the turn from turning back on itself, while continuing to identify its excess with a force. In what follows, the confrontation with these two moments orients my questions. Can there be a courage free of sacrifice, a courage devoid of force? So my first part is called Dialectic of the Near and Far, Totality. For Hölderlin, at least for the one who became known as Hölderlin after 1800, the infinite strangeness of the absolute, its violence, is not meant to disappear in its spiritual realization, as it is for Hegel. Rather, the absolute arises immanently in a particular living world, and the synthesis of thinking and feeling create forms in the vicinity of its strangeness, forms which exceed both the faculty of the synthesis, that of representing, and the coordinates of this world. In such a dialectic, the problem of the contradiction between the orders of the absolute and the finite is not that of a negative subsumption, but that of a proximity and distance that mediate the exteriority of the orders of the absolute and the finite. Thus, a first assumption can be made. The task that this dialectic of the near and the far sets itself is to create a finite measure for the violence of the absolute, to make its appearance possible in a particular historical awe. In the text called Becoming in Decline, dated from the turn of a century, the poet evokes a multiplicity of worlds against the backdrop of a single infinite world that runs through them all. I will now have a long quote of Hölderlin, so I'll take my crystal breath. For the world of all worlds, the all in all which always is, only presents itself in all time or in the decline, the instant, or more genetically, in the becoming of the instant and in the beginning of time and world. And this decline and beginning is like language, expression, sign, presentation of a living yet particular whole, which in its effects becomes like the former ones, namely, in such a manner that within it as well as in language there seems to lie on the one side less or no living existence, yet everything on the other side. In the living existence, there prevails a mode of relation of thematics, even though all others can be intuited within it. The possibility of all relations is predominant in the transition, yet the particular one needs to be taken, to be derived from it, so that through it there emerges infinity, the finite effect. End of quote. A particular whole has a specific historical turn, a way of assembling the relationships of beings that people it, a way of assembling the relationships of the beings that people it, of making a type of relationship prevail or predominate. It is only when the crystallization of the unity constituting that measure unravels, when its predominance proves insufficient for its constancy, that this whole can become legible for itself. The decline of a world reveals it as a real nothingness. Its decomposition is sucked into the infinite at the same time as it carries new indeterminate possibilities. This is exactly how Hölderlin describes the situation resulting from the revolutionary break in his letter to Johann Gottfried Ebel in January 1797. The variegated, indecisive contradictions of the times, the chaotic world will either lead to annihilation or to a new organization. For the new to be able to determine itself, a future revolution of all convictions and modes of representation is required. That is to say, in order for the effective political revolution to be able to recapture its own nothingness, to adjust its infinite real excess to the finite ideal sensibility and belief that are emerging, it is necessary that its real nothingness be traversed in reverse, that the possible that it delivers be recalled point by point in each destroyed element. This journey backwards brings forth the new as it transforms the past into what is recollected. The parallel between the essay Becoming in Decline and the letter to Ebel seems quite obvious, but it quickly shows its limit. Hölderlin does not take a historical event, but the tragic as the operator of this process of recollection. For the poet, tragic hybris is indeed a real nothingness, and it attests to the decline of Greek beauty. But, at least explicitly, it delivers no possibility of the new. Its excess remains captive of the all in all as concisely stated in The Meanings of Tragedies, a text written around 1802. Let me briefly recall the argument there. The all never appears in its effective strength. Its appearance belongs to its weakness. In tragedy, weakness acquires the sign zero, a sign of its own ineffectivity, a sign that shows nothing but its voiding the dramatic confrontations concerning the relation to the gods. These dramatic confrontations push this weakness to the point of its rupture. The alternation of the representations engender the culminating point of its own interruption. a counter-rhythmic caesura. Where all mediation with the gods breaks down, where all difference to them is abolished, where immediacy arises, frankly exposed, says Hölderlin. The saturation of all representation, its retreat from any appearance, or what Hölderlin calls representation itself in the remarks on Oedipus, surges from within the imminent dislocation of the drama. With this assimilation of weakness to the sign 0, the ambivalence of a Hölderlinian conception of tragic excess becomes clear. What is this sign 0? Hölderlin does not locate the caesura of tragedy in the death of the hero. In both Oedipus Rex and Antigone, it arises from the speeches of Tiresias. Furthermore, in Sophocles, Oedipus' death is deferred, placed under the sign of exile. Nevertheless, if, as Hölderlin adamantly asserts, all the representations of tragedy are ordered by one ultimate caesura, then the sign 0 also determines the dramatic figures. This entails that their relationship to death is not a sign of their solitude, rather, their mortal solitude is a sign of the destiny that destroys their contingency. The relationship to death never really succeeds in being a relationship to the separation from the gods, since any difference to them is swamped, abolished in the caesura. It is precisely this sacrifice of all appearance that makes tragedy capable of an intuition of totality, even if it is an intuition of its inaccessibility. The question posed by Hölderlin is thus not that of creating a finite measure for the absolute, as was our first assumption, but rather that of bringing the absolute closer by means of destroying all effectivity of appearance. But this also leads to a dead end. For if destiny is simply a return of the aorgic within appearance, then no new effect can emerge from it. The empty transport of a tragic can only provide an intuition of totality by freezing the rip of time, turning it towards anxiety, towards the fixity of death. And for a long period, Hölderlin's tragic poetology was tethered to this fixity, precisely because in it, origin could be identified with totality, a totality he was not willing to renounce. However, the impasse in his writing of the Empedocles tragedy, the doubts that beset him about the revolution, without him ever disavowing it, all led to a shift. The historicity attached to tragic decline acquired a new importance. What hybris communicates to us moderns is no longer the eruption of destiny, but the dissociation of the godly and the human, the joint rupture of both the Junonian sobriety of beautiful appearance and the excess on which it is based. We can no longer tragically nullify the measure of our difference from the gods, since this measure itself is what we lack. The death of a tragic hero is behind us. Our world is one of dispersion. Our weakness is precisely that of the dysmoron, or the absence of destiny. I will now read the poem. There's a German version circulating. I thank Nathan, who gave me 3 versions of the English translation, and I've sort of, it's just bricolage, yeah, sorry. Okay, so, aren't many living known to, I mean, if you speak German, please read the German, yeah, because it's really not a good translation. You
could read the German and we can read it.
Okay, that would be great. That sounds, thank you. Sind denn dir nicht bekannt viele Lebendigen? Geht auf Waren dein Fuß nicht, wie auf Teppichen. Drum, mein Genius, tritt nur bar ins Leben und sorge nicht. Was geschieht, es sei alles gelegen dir. sei zur Freude gereimt, oder was könnte denn dich beleidigen, Herz, was dich begegnen, wohin du sollst? Denn seit himmlischen gleich Menschen ein einsam Welt und die himmlischen selbst führet, der Einkehr zu, der Gesang und der Fürstenchor, nach Arten, so waren auch wir, die Zungen des Volks, gern bei Lebenden, wo sich vieles gesellt, freudig und jedem gleich, jedem offen, so ist ja unser Vater des Himmels Gott, der den denkenden Tag Armen und Reichen gönnt, der zur Wende der Zeit uns die Entschlafenden, aufgerichtet an goldenen Gängelbändeln wie Kinder, hält. Gut auch sind und geschickt einem zu etwas wir, wenn wir kommen mit Kunst und von den himmlischen einen bringen, doch selber bringen schickliche Hände wir. In the moment after 1800, so this poem is, as I said in the beginning, one of the middle poem of the Night Songs, and it was written 1802, 1803. In the moment after 1800, which encompasses the translations, the most accomplished reflections on Sophoclean tragedy, the odes and the late hymns, the defaulting of the gods becomes itself the object of a poetic process. The difficulty in grasping this point is linked to a discrepancy. Hölderlin's poetology, as we have seen, is a poetology derived from the tragic, whilst his late odes and hymns have ceased to be tragic, or at least have, was maybe a bit massive, at least have diverged from the tragic. Let me briefly recall again Hölderlin's modelization as it differs from its tragic tendency. Appearing is relative to a violence, an inappropriable living reality, or an ungrounded striving. Its possibilities are created by appearance without ever being exhausted in those appearances. Thus, their becoming in time, the historical disposition of those appearances, acquires a necessity. In tragedy, the caesura, the empty transport, the monstrous coupling of man and God, merges with the eruption of the gods, putting an end to contingency, turning back on itself. In the later poems, and particular in the ode we're dealing with, ineptitude, I will call it now, this turn back is undone or moved through, turning away from itself. The issue is no longer to intuit the inaccessibility of totality, but to experience and render manifest in the procedures deployed by the poem the alterations and ruptures that they introduce within appearance. It is the shift towards contingency and the specific courage involved that needs to be highlighted. A shift which refers to an internal tension in Hölderlin's thought. Poetry, grappling with the defaulting of the godly, no longer disposes of any prior measure. Nor does it, I quote Hölderlin from the remarks on Antigone, stage the world on a reduced scale, as Hölderlin understands Sophocles' art to do. Likewise, the poem no longer represents the strangeness of the godly in a heroic death of an objectified, dramatic, or epic figure. It is from a solitary, contingent relationship to this strangeness, to this real nothingness, around which revolve the orders, human, godly, of equality, having lost the principle of their connection, that the poet's courage is sustained. There is no longer one culminating empty transport. The emptiness of the transport passes into the relations, both to the godly and to the historical world. This transformation of a poet's task is the object of the ode Ineptitude. What is important here for me is not to posit the poem as the basis of a systematization of Hölderlin's work. Rather, relying on its many interpretations, I want to shed light on the different relationship between speech, letter, courage, and the subject it clears the way for. This attempt both borrows from and distances itself from Walter Benjamin's text, two poems by Friedrich Hölderlin. The first thing I borrow from him is the choice of this poem. I also borrow the starting point, namely the insistence on the gap between an actual relation to the world and its transport, its transformation into the object of poetic activity within the poem. I borrow from Benjamin his way of serializing the relations of a poem as the infinity of the connections that act in the finite world, an infinity in which mythological figures are abolished in the previous versions of a poem in favor of mediating between the spiritual, cognitive, and sensitive functions. I distance myself from Benjamin as soon as he eliminates the disadjustment inherent to poetic language and recasts the latter into what he calls an exclusive reign of relation. By doing this, Benjamin posits the oriental principle of dissolution over the formative principle of the Greek. He then leads back the dissolution of all figures within the poem to the heroic death of a poet, which has thereby become the center to which all its relations lead. In so doing, he once again transfers the interruption of tragic language to lyrical language. The poetic identity of extreme infinite form and formlessness returns in the poet's sacrifice, which is no longer distinguished in any way from the origin of the song. His courage then coincides with an indifference to life, a pure gift of self to the relationship. The poet's immanence in a dead poetic world, Benjamin's expression, mystically replaces the intuition of origin proper to ancient tragedy. Letting go of this, I will pay attention to the disadjustment of a relation to immanence, to the poetic readjustment of its fault line, asking how these two moments intersect repeatedly within the poem. That death has become detached from totality does not mean that the relation to death disappears. It simply indicates that death is no longer submerged by destiny, but differentiates itself as a constitutive separation of each singular life. The absence of the gods becomes a threshold where another relationship to the limit of language is played out. Hölderlin names this threshold in The Poet's Vocation, another ode, in the last line of the last stanza, as if to punctuate the breakthrough around which these odes dedicated to a poetic activity are assembled, he writes, "And there is no need for weapons, nor for lures, as long as the faulting of God helps." We had a piece of this poem this morning. In the space opened up by this faulting, nothing commands the poet anymore, so that his activity can only even take place by becoming a task for itself. This task condenses several operations to which the sequences of ineptitude correspond. The poem has three unequal sequences: the poet's advent to his task, in which language plays no role, a very long period in which the recollection of the song and the turning point of historical time intersect and double out, a highly abstract final stanza describing poetic activity in the present tense. The course of a poem begins with a turnaround of the poet in the first two stanzas. Questions and rhetorical negative exhortations show the poet's task to be dependent upon a singular relationship to life. Aren't many living known to you? Do not your feet walk on truth as on carpets? Therefore, my genius, step straight into life, naked, without a care. Whatever happens, welcome the use of it, rhyme it to joy. For what thing is there that could befall your heart insultingly, if you are going the way you must? The only indication that the address is spoken by the poet is the my attached to the term genius. The gait of his foot generates the expanse that binds truth to the carpets, the spread of a texture. Exclamation and question marks alternate in chiasmos. Question, question, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, question. Transforming the relationship of life to its poetic destination into an uncertain object, opening up a space of hesitation stretched between a step to be taken, the foot, the wound to the heart that could be inflicted by others, and the anticipation of a place where expression is created. The exhortation framed by the questions names a threshold to be crossed, and the attitude that emerges therefrom. The surrounding world lends itself to intelligence, to a way, if only intelligence and the way disarm. Something opens up to the poetic word where life cuts itself off from what binds it to the concern or care for itself, in order to enter naked, into this life. For tragedy, let us remember, the weakness of appearing is cancelled out by the sign 0, a sign of the insignificance of death in regard to destiny. The poet's exhortation to enter naked into life reverses the orientation of the sign 0. Since the insignificance of death is no longer a sign of anything but itself, outside of any sacrificial relationship to a totality, its weakness or ineptitude can then be included in the appearance as the light shed on its provisional character, included in a plane where waiting mingles with what awaits it, where life becomes what happens to it, where life becomes in what happens to it. Whatever happens, welcome the use of it. The poet meets his task in an ascent to ineptitude. The tragic and this poem, ineptitude, are both linked to the point of rupture that death introduces into language. Yet nothing is the same. In tragedy, this point is the climax. The alternation of representations is interrupted in an empty transport. In the poem, the initial turnaround, rather than abolishing contingency, reaches it. What the separation from care produces is a solitary, disarmed contingency. The act of separation is charged with a specific quality of affect called courage, bearing a singular inclination. Having dissolved all care, nothing is any longer destiny to the poet, not even his own death. He orients himself towards the radical absence of all security, towards what is no longer mortifying nor insulting, to the chance given in the task he sets himself. What the act of separation experiences is therefore no longer an all-powerful destiny that would cause its act, but only its mortal loneliness from which nothing can deliver it, and whose striving can become the opening both towards a different mediation with the godly and a different involvement in the world. Rather than turning back on itself, as did the tragic break, the initial disadjustment seems to have passed through anxiety, transporting itself into the relations it displaces. Yet this distinction itself needs to be clarified. Is it relevant to contrast the tragic and the affect of anxiety associated with it to a courage whose features can be grasped by the lyrical subject? To start, this distinction between courage and anxiety should not make us forget that both arise out of a fault line, which always provokes a paralysis. There is therefore no symmetry between courage and anxiety, even if there are two ways of relating to death, even if the poet's courage resonates throughout the processes created by the poem. The paradox of the courageous asceticism that Hölderlin unfolds is that it hinges on and comes from anxiety, but without reducing the excess of solitude either to the call of death, the call of order, or the will to know. By crossing the threshold of its own loss, asceticism can cease interpreting its mortal contingency as a threat. Hence, a torsion of a negativity that affects courage. Its essential determination is no longer the confrontation with death, which always implies a sacrificial dimension, but the negation of the omnipotence of death. This alteration constitutes the object of the poem's exhortative opening, which acts as a step towards reliance. The paradox of such asceticism is underlined by Badiou in Theory of the Subject when he notes that the subject is, I quote, not unilaterally tragic, although there is such a thing as tragedy. Except that in this book, the political overdetermination, the focus on a subject for antagonism, classically leads him to see courage as a force inherent in excess, where this poem poses another question. What is the reliance of a poetic word on its own weakness capable of? I will now read la suite. For since humans, equal to gods, a lonely wild, and the gods themselves, are led to recollection by the song and the prince's choir in its kinds, so were we, tongues of people, gladly amongst the living, where many kinds of living mingle, joyful and equal to anyone, open to anyone, for this is the God of heaven's way, who to rich and poor, another translation, grants the thinking daylight, and at the turning of time holds us, the asleep, upright on golden lading strings, such as we do for children. The asleep is not bad. Assumption of contingency does not coincide with the initial wish that we saw in the first two stanzas to be at one with the world. The stanzas seem to fall short and are supplemented by a long argumentative parenthesis, for since, that promises to underpin the way. In it, recollection and anticipation prove indistinguishable. Its period corresponds perfectly to Hölderlin's remarks on inversion in his sketches on poetics. I quote, "We have the inversions of words in the period, the greater and more effective must men be the inversion of the periods themselves. The logical position of the periods, in which the main period is followed by the becoming by the goal by the end, and the subordinate phrases are only attached behind the main ones to which they relate, can only serve the poet very rarely." End of quote. The inversion of the poem here is a long reversed descent, given that each advance in the sentence makes all previous attributions uncertain. Syntactic and grammatical interferences inscribe these reversals around points of indecision. I know we're not supposed to do this. I tried 60 million things that was said just before, but I will try approximately to say what's going on. Approximately, the way can be recounted thus. The song, subject of the third stanza, turns both humans, the gods, a solitary wild, towards hospitality, in which the prince's choir participates in distinct ways. It is impossible to determine if the solitary wild names the lonely state of both men and gods in their separation, or only the humans themselves. All of this is located in the past as a recollection. Parallel to this song, the poets, tongues of the people, were gladly amongst the living, while the attributions of a subject to the proposition of inclusion, where many kinds of living mingle, joyful and equal to anyone, open to anyone, also remains uncertain. It can be attributed either to the poets, who count themselves among the living, or to the God of heaven, who counts the poets among those who are assembled through his principle. The God of heaven grants a principle of equality relating to the nakedness of life, without regard for the difference between rich and poor. He also fulfills an awakening disciplining orthopedic function, since he straightens up the asleep, so they at last practice the gift lavished upon them by the principle. Here again, it is not certain if the asleep include the poets and the living, or refer only to the latter. In the unfolding of this period, the equivocations of syntax and grammar are irreducible, and they give rise to strictly contradictory commentaries. Courage reconfigures itself within the tensions of this equivocation. First, let me note that the song is a function of memory. The song of mortals conducts the mediation of gods and humans, which comes from the past and constitutes the present of a historical moment. But to what exactly does this present refer? Paradoxically, it also appears in a past tense. So were we, tongues of people, gladly amongst the living, in the following stanza. The mediation within the song itself shows two things simultaneously: the distance between the gods and the humans, the bridging of the gap that separates them. Thus, the blinking of equality with the gods, which is put in tension with the persistence of a loneliness that an insular nominal phrase, a solitary wild, attaches to it. Regarding the attribution of solitude, we can state the following hypothesis. The living corporeal singularity of a solitary wild weighs down the diaphanous series of abstractions, the humans, the god, the song, the princess choir, brings the world back into the movement of recollection, implies in its music the impulse of the foot, of the heart, of the genius. In short, carries over the poet of a preceding stanza. Thus, the Song of Mortals no longer has any stable, prevailing historical form in modernity, capable of unifying the human with the gods, constitutive of a historical moment, as was, according to Hölderlin, the tragic for the Greeks. Its composition depends on a solitary wild actualizing the fault line from which their relationships proceed, keeping open its slippages, surveying its possibilities. The recollection of the song depends on certain humans becoming poets in the present. And for a poet who fulfills such a task, the absence of a god no longer needs to be overcome, since the absence is precisely his striving and his chance, the chance to explore the gaps that relate us to their lack, and thus to create a process of thought, a process of sentiment. What courage is required here? First of all, that of registering a loss, of giving it up to an outside. At least, this is how I propose to interpret the imperfect tense that registers the mediation of the song. So were we also, gladly amongst the living, where many kinds mingle, joyful and equal to anyone, open to anyone. The imperfect tense indicates that the poets were once in direct community with the living, that there was a continuity between the presence of the gods, the celebration in song, and the association of men. That this continuity has come undone is precisely what the absence of the gods means. The creation of community no longer depends on the gods or even on the song, but on the sociability of community. The sociability of community depends on a principle of equality that awakens it to the historical turn of time, that orders the relation of rich and poor. The dynamic of the period doubly rescinds the conventional image of harmony, where many kinds of living mingle, joyful and equal to anyone, open to anyone. The poet detaches itself from it, politics transfers it to a principle. This image appears only so as to dissolve. It shows the lure of the initial wish in the two first stanzas to be at one with the world, and with it, the lure of classicism's harmonization. So we have a lure that appears in the poem and dissolves. It's almost like a small piece of critique of ideology within the poem. The break of the modern conveys two new dangers that lie in wait for the poet. In view of a twofold process of a present time, any search, in and through song, for an unrestricted harmony with the new freedom could only inflict on the poem the wounds mentioned at the opening, subjecting his poetic approach to objectification. This is all the more so since the French Revolution itself wanted to be the fulfillment of such a harmony, that it purported to submit the transport of sensibility to the transport of a political, to the ethos of a citoyen. On the other hand, to identify the hospitality with oracular speech, to enclose it within the eternal community of song, would be simply to forget what freedom means elsewhere, namely outside of the poem. This is probably the way that Heidegger reads Hölderlin. Thus courage is held to maintain within the poem the difference between each transport to its outside, the way in which the hospitality of a song seconds or interrupts the awakening of historical time reverberates in the way the poetic process disadjusts from itself. Hence the constant interference in this very long period of the two procedures of transformation, of hospitality and awakening, which syntactically and grammatically encroach upon one another, whose old hierarchical distribution is abolished without the difference in tasks being cancelled. This is what Hölderlin sort of integrates into the Oriental principle. The mediation differentiates linking the gods to men through the song, linking thought to the turning point of historical time through the godly principle. I come now to the last stanza. Good for something, able to something, we also are who come with art, and the gods of heaven bring one. But ourselves we bring our ready and able hands. The argumentative parenthesis closes of these three stanzas, and only now, in a last turn, a separate stanza, does the poet's task become clear, if one wants, conjugated in the present tense. This present tense connects back with the opening stanzas, beyond the context. At stake are no longer the conditions in which the poem acts, but the poetic act, insofar as it becomes an object for itself. The poetic act is considered in the sole light of its possibility. Abstraction is at its peak, good for something to someone, or the dense repetition of words, schicklich, geschickt, wir. It is stated how such an act can take place without any actual way being traced. The poets bring a god, and they themselves bring their hands. Henceforth, the gods are no longer an order unto themselves. One of them, brought by the poets, has become a possible figure of community that art brings. The poets can be mediators of this community because, having shed themselves of all care, they share what escapes all appropriation. They can do this precisely because this community is proper to no one. In relation to the first stanza, the act has become impoverished. It no longer turns to many living, but to one at a time, creating a community that lacks any principle of collective assembly. Similarly, the poetic act no longer aims at totality, rather it detotalizes effectivity through appearance. It brings the thought of a god, wresting from the predominant form of a fixed turn of appearance, the provisional character and the singular turn of a newly created possibility. To whom does the poet transmit a possibility? He passes it on by introducing it into the narrow confines of our infantile culture, as Hölderlin has announced in a letter to his publisher, Friedrich at the end of 1803. Except that what is at stake here is not a sacrifice to the reader, as the letter might still suggest, but the introduction of something foreign within those boundaries. Foreign both to the principle the principle, political principle, foreign both to that, and to the differences between rich and poor. To recapitulate, the poet makes a gift of something inappropriable, the possibility of a gratuitous relationship in a collective space organized by calculable exchange. What he is good for, what he passes on, is therefore in excess of a utilitarian measure proper to diurnal life. Relative to this measure, his gift is without measure. It is detached from both the effectivity of the social and the regulating principle of the politics. His gift is good neither for the rich or the poor. It is good only for the alteration it may provoke in someone, and over which the poet has no control. Thus, not all are poets, but the courage shown by the poet can ignite in anyone. Its disruption is for who wants, to use a term of Stéphane Mallarmé. Only in this way can the relationship be free and shared. In other words, leaving Hölderlin's vocabulary behind for a moment, the poet's gift can only be transmitted at the positive risk of breaking existing bonds of recognition by creating a shared symbolic disorder, and at the negative risk of being completely ignored, reduced to the nothingness of madness that his creation is neighbor to. The courage of a disarmed and gratuitous utterance capable of diffusing the violence of order and undoing its imperative. This is what Hölderlin calls peace. The stanza unfolds around a bend. The poet introduces the possibility of an untamable relationship by introducing themselves into this relation, by bringing their hands. In this way, their gift is also associated with a doing, a crafting. Poets provide their deft hands, schickliche Hände, which resonates with geschickt, meaning both scent and deft in German. Metaphorically, the poet's hands undoubtedly indicate, at the end of this poem, the transition from song to letter, or from song to sign. The poem is thus the site of a tension, or I would even say an aporia. It is divided between an incalculable gift and a calculation of craft. It is indexed on the inappropriable, while its gift refers to the hands as the exercise of poetic craft, which Holderlin associates, in his remarks on Oedipus, with procedures and a law of calculation that can be learned and repeated in its execution. Such learning contrasts with the title of the poem, Ineptitude, which casts the poet as clumsy or awkward. The first thing to notice is that in the poem, contrarily to what is stated in the remarks on Oedipus, the hands directly associate this craft with the poet's body. This entanglement proves to be an integral part of the process. The inarticulable, untamed contingency that rips into language is transposed into the poetically calculable points of indecision as to the predicative attributions produced by the arrangements of periods and chiasmus. There is both an event and a craft. That dimension of life will always be the dimension of life that will always remain subtracted from language, which introduces a pure unfolding, what Hölderlin calls das Ungebundenste, a pure unbinding, manifests itself in the poem as a disobjectification, as a random encounter within it of representation, feeling, and reasoning for which a measure must be created. It is in this way, craft is not opposed to the inappropriable, but arises precisely from the failure of all given measure. The measure of a poem consists in readjusting singularity to its own awkwardness, in experiencing the versatile adjustments, the twists that its relation to the world calls for. It thus entails the dissolution of all subsumption in favor of what Hölderlin calls the open. The poem creates for the poem, the poem creates, and there is a cut here. So the poem, the cut introduced by language. So a poem creates for the poet a new body. There's a cut from the old body and creates a new body outside himself. Feet, heart, a solitary world, wild, tongues, hands. And so doing, he succeeds in creating a world other than our own, within the reality of our own, without sacrifice, without resurrecting the celestials, simply by inscribing a point of exile, a breach that accounts for the violence inherent to the absolute. It is the skillful materialization of this absolute breach that becomes a gift that is offered to anyone who endeavors to dwell poetically on the earth. Let me recall Hölderlin's formula for the exile implied by the death of God, or in the words of this poem, the turn of time. I quote, "To turn the desire to leave this world for another into a desire to leave another world for this one." What does the singular twist that the poet's task imposes on this desire in this poem look like? If we consider the trajectory that rhythms the poem from the foot advancing on the carpet to the hands carried forward, we might almost discern a body doing a cartwheel. Celan, or Celan reading Hölderlin. This is another way of inverting the orphic origin of this poem, and it is the poet's courage. Thank you.